Okay, everybody, welcome to another exciting video from Nonviolence Works. I'm here with my co-founder, co-host, Priya Darshini Kaul. Hello, Priya.
Hi, Sander and Sarah.
And we have a very special guest today. Yes, her name is Sarah Freeman-Woolpert, and she is the Advocacy Director at the Friends Committee of National Legislation, which is a DC peace and nonviolence lobbying group as a part of the Quaker faith. Sarah, welcome to our video series.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of your work. I know you're a writer with Waging Nonviolence. You do a lot of work around peace and nonviolence, and you also have this great day job. A lot of people don't know that the Quakers actually have this really cool lobbying group. It's in DC. It has a highly visible office down on C Street, right near Capitol Hill. Why don't you tell us first a little bit about what you do as the Advocacy Director at the Friends Committee on National Legislation?
Sure. So yeah, I work at FCNL as the manager of the advocacy teams, which is a big part of our grassroots work. FCNL as a Quaker lobby is really working to support a whole range of legislative issues for peace and justice in federal policy. And a big part of my work is kind of in tandem with, we have, lobbyists who are actually working on Capitol Hill to lobby members of Congress for legislation around all sorts of things, from the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, to ending endless wars, to Native American rights, to immigration reform. And there's so many different things. And a lot of my work has been training and mobilizing people all around the country, in congressional districts around the country, how to try to kind of influence their legislators on pieces of legislation around peace and justice, primarily around endless wars, US militarism. And a lot of this, as a Quaker lobby, is something that we do really differently than a lot of organizations in this space. So we are trying to sustain nonviolent Quaker principles in our advocacy, and trying to stay in conversation with members of Congress who are really difficult to be in conversation with, especially when it's really difficult to be in conversation with them. And a lot of my job is to kind of support people around the country to feel like the policymaking process can be more accessible to them, to try to sort of see what it means to speak truth to power in almost a literal sense, and to try to take some of the work or the kind of knowledge or background that I have in nonviolence in theory and in practice, and try to integrate that into the kind of policy change world that often feels really inaccessible and intimidating to the average person, and kind of feels discouraging. Like, how could we ever possibly, influence the decisions that Congress is making in our name? I'm trying to kind of provide people with more support and more tools to feel like they know how to do that. Okay.
Great. Speaking of which, I saw that you recently, last year, wrote about Black Lives Matter and how the struggle against police violence and racism inside institutions like the police can be tied into the history of nonviolence. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure, yeah. So I have like kind of two different hats. And I think the longer that I work at FCNL, the more that they feel like just one hat, that they're kind of integrated more. What I wrote about for Waging Nonviolence last year after the murder of George Floyd was looking at the movement for Black lives, but this kind of broader movement against police violence and racist policing in the United States, and looking at this theory of the pillars of support, and looking at how there are all these different actors who were coming together to really make that a moment where so much was taking place, because there were bus drivers, public bus drivers who were refusing to drive people to jail. There were teachers' unions who were refusing to let cops into schools. There were like donut shop owners who were refusing to serve police officers, or, all sorts of things like that. So,
no donuts. That's hitting where it hurts. Jeez.
Well, things like all of these different people who were kind of figuring out what do I have power over, and kind of what role can I play in this moment? And so that's something, as someone who's written for Waging Nonviolence for the past 5 years that I thought was really interesting because I could kind of see how all of these pieces were coming together, and wanted to kind of amplify that perspective, and sort of lift up all the amazing work that was happening. But it also is something that I bring into my work at FCNL, because I always think, nonviolent movements and uprisings and social movements are a product of so many different actors taking a piece of it and then really coming together and figuring out how those pieces fit together to form a much broader movement. So at FCNL, we are a piece of that work. A lot of the work that we do hopefully will support and kind of create the legislative groundwork for movements to really make progress. But of course, we're not the whole thing. We're a big piece of it, but we're just a part of a larger movement a lot of the time.
Let me come back on something you said. You said that sometimes you work with members of Congress who are inherently antagonistic, and I think that might be a delicious topic to dive into. What's that like? I mean, somebody who is maybe has a voting record, who's extremely pro-war, pro-military, maybe they have huge defense contracting interests in their district. What's that like, and how do you reach those people?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult one because a lot of this work is personal work that each of us are doing to try to figure out how to stay in conversation with the most difficult people in some ways, or the people who, when we really dig inside ourselves, the people who we least want to talk to or to be in touch with. And for me, that's always something that I've found is really unique and resonates a lot with me in the history and theories of nonviolence is, kind of this pull to really challenge ourselves to stay in conversation at the most difficult times, that being sort of important in and of itself. So while I also do some of this advocacy with my own, legislators, a lot of my job is coaching and support for people in Tennessee and Texas and Missouri and North Carolina and, wherever else, to try to support them to stay in the conversation. And it's really difficult, as you can imagine, especially, right now. And there's extreme polarization in Congress. There are, members of Congress who supported this insurrection in January, and we're really grappling as a community. I think the wider Quaker world, the wider peace community is grappling with, what does it mean to try to speak to that of God in each person, which is how Quakers kind of frame this, when that person has supported really harmful, violent actions, policies. And for us, one of the steps that we think needs to happen is to try to figure out how to shift these conversations about pieces of policy that can have such a huge impact on our lives, to try to shift them away from all of the contentious places we could go, and to try to instead ground ourselves in common values. And a lot of times that's easier said than done, but all the time. But one of the things that we do, right now, we're focused a lot on trying to, end endless wars, this broader push towards ending endless wars by trying to restore some of the checks and balances that could prevent the president from having sole authority to decide when we go to war. And that means that instead of focusing just on, the facts and the statistics, what we're really trying to do is to get people to think about the human stories that inspire them to try to work for peace. And so, a lot of my work is really more like a coach to get people to think about how all of our lives connect to these big, abstract, depersonalized policy issues. How can we humanize these? And so just last night, I was doing a training with a group in North Carolina, and they're thinking to meet with Senators Burr and Senator Tillis. And those might be really difficult conversations, but they were thinking about what are the stories that we could share with them to try to connect, even though we know that's going to be hard. And one of them shared a story about working with people who are incarcerated in North Carolina, and some of whom served in the military and experienced a lot of trauma, and that led to alcoholism, and that led to this cascade effect in their life, and now they're incarcerated. And they talked about sort of believing in everyone's potential and the harm that military service can do on people who are in the military, and that makes me think of something that I think, Quakers say or peace activists say, which is loving the soldier and hating the war. And how can we disassociate those things and try to think about the human costs of, the post 9/11 wars, the wars on terror. And so for us, it's really grounding our connections with Congress, our work to try to build more peaceful policy in the human aspects of how these issues affect our lives. But it's hard, these are really difficult conversations to have.
Wow, this is really powerful stuff, Sarah. I hear you, what you're talking about, common ground, making connections to people that you don't think you might have common ground with. And I wanted to ask you, since FCNL is an organization based on the nonviolence of Jesus, is there any time that you, and evangelical Christians, even though they tend to be rather conservative and right-wing and pro-military, are very literal about the Bible. I wonder if the nonviolence in the New Testament, in the words of Jesus and the teachings and the message and the practice of Jesus, I wonder if the nonviolence of Jesus ever comes up in a conversation in which you, as somebody who's coaching groups, is trying to reach out and connect around common values with evangelical politicians.
This looks different depending on the issue, and I think depending on the legislators and depending on the group. But I do think that being a faith-based organization and being one of the oldest faith-based lobbies, in Washington, D.C. or around the country, we are positioned in such a way that we can actually go into certain offices and have certain conversations that a number of other groups can't, partly because we're coming from a faith perspective. And so depending on how each staff member or each lobbyist kind of brings that into their conversations, I think we all probably navigate this differently. We're not all Quaker, we're not all Christian, but FCNL is guided by Quakers around the country. And I do think being a faith-based, being a Quaker organization means that there are a number of congressional offices that listen to us in a different way. And there might be more opening for conversations that would just not happen with other groups. And one of the things that I know some of our local teams, they're called the advocacy teams, around the country, mostly Quaker, but not entirely Quaker. And some of them will start off their meetings with members of Congress by holding silence before they start their meeting with these congressional staff. And it's kind of surprising to those staff, as you can imagine, when that happens. They're not expecting it. They might be expecting this to be a group that, is coming in and, angry or frustrated or, and we really try to coach them in how can we go into these conversations where we're speaking our truth and we're grounded in our integrity. And also we're going to go in with a different approach where we're really trying to see to see that of God in that person, to try to understand what's motivating that person, what brings them into the room. That's a really different thing, I think. And, I've heard this in terms of our work on environmental justice, that as a faith-based organization, if we talk about, addressing the climate crisis in terms of, the God's creation, and the earth and wanting to protect nature. And if we speak from a faith perspective in some ways, I think that that's going to resonate differently depending on who we're talking to, if they're also coming from a faith perspective. I don't lobby on our climate work, but I know that in building the Climate Solutions Caucus, I think that's been a piece of it. And certainly for us, training and mobilizing other faith leaders around the country to say, even if they're not Quaker, but finding other faith leaders and training them and supporting them and saying, here's how your perspective as a person of faith could actually really, turn the tide on this really important issue that your member of Congress hasn't decided how they're going to vote yet because they're just not hearing from anyone. But if you get 3 or 4 people of faith to go in and speak about it, sometimes that can really change things. So both for us as a Quaker and faith-led organization, but also in the way that we train other people to do the work, we kind of see that as, at least for me, I feel like that's a part of kind of the ministry of the work, is that you know, this is something that I can do to show other people how to bring that power into the room when many of us feel really powerless in those conversations. And the faith perspective is absolutely a big piece of this, and something that makes it really unique.
This has been great. That's really a great answer. I hear you. I have been asking all the questions so far, so I want to see if Priya has any of her Priya-approved questions that she made a list of Priya-approved questions and cleared them with you. So we don't want to neglect the Priya Dashini
questions. I was actually no, those are great questions. It actually talks a lot about what you write off as quiet power, and I think you're kind of speaking to that quiet power through those questions and telling us how impactful this coaching and the FCNL work can be with people in some very difficult conversations. To extend that, I also talked to you previously and read some of your work on a lot of the grassroots level work you do, and some of the work you do in the international space with children. Maybe you haven't been able to do as much because we couldn't travel last year, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about that work and what kind of impact you see of that work on the international stage using nonviolence.
Yeah, thank you. So another one of these hats, but again, something that all of it integrates, I think. Before I came to FCNL, I lived in the Balkans, and mostly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, also in Serbia, for about 2 years. And I was initially there as a researcher. I was kind of learning about how people in, you know, a post-conflict or conflict-affected society were engaging in nonviolent resistance and activism, youth activism. This was around the time that Trump was elected back in the United States, at which point everyone I knew in Bosnia said, if you think that we've got, you know, a conflict-affected society, you should probably go home because that's where the real division is. In which I, you know, took that advice and moved back to the US. But one of the things that I did while I was there was I was working with youth activists and sort of strategizing and sharing with them some of these principles as they were engaging in their own sort of nonviolent or local resistance movements. One of the biggest things that happened while I was there was a group of high school students in a town called Jajce. They organized this sort of local resistance campaign against an attempt to segregate their high school. They won. It was a really big deal. And so I would kind of ride the bus around to towns like this and would talk to them about different kinds of principles around, you know, constructive resistance and the pillars of support and spectrum of allies. And I had a copy of Beautiful Trouble that I brought around with me, and like we were always, you know, reading through. And, you know, in addition to that, I've now been doing, I'm a teacher for a summer class, which now is online for high school students, mostly in Bosnia, but now that it's virtual, we also had students from Yemen and from Iraq and other places. And we were kind of talking about some of the histories and theories and, you know, case studies of nonviolent resistance, so that these young people who are like 15 years old and trying to organize like a local campaign in their high school in Iraq can actually bring some of this into their work. And so the way that I've always seen this, you know, my position within the world of nonviolent social movements is really different than someone like George Lakey. But I always see one of the gifts that I can bring to this is that I really like figuring out how can I share some of this information and some of the stories and the examples that I've been able to kind of gather and understand and study with all of these mentors. And how can I make that as accessible as possible to people who might otherwise not find that information at all? You know, these are kids who aren't reading Waging Nonviolence, and they're not, you know, they're not involved in this kind of work. But if we can kind of share some of these stories, which is why I love Waging Nonviolence, that storytelling, information sharing process, just like making the advocacy tools accessible to people around the United States, can give people a sense of their own power. And that's what I've seen with some of my students who go on to do these big, you know, campaigns and organize their own programs and disseminate the information more widely. So I see it as having these ripple effects.
That's great. And so the virtual medium actually helps you perhaps get further. Different countries at one point rather than restrict to one region, maybe there's some advantage in that as well.
Yeah, and In general, I think, although of course it comes with all sorts of additional things that make this work hard and that people are really suffering through it. But
Right.
in some ways, having virtual access to trainings and to classes and workshops that I've been leading, in some ways makes it more accessible. So if I'm doing a training for people in rural Wyoming who want to talk to their legislators, they now are having Zoom calls with their legislators rather than having to travel across the state to the one district office that might be 6 hours away. Or so in some ways kind of the same as my students from Yemen and Iraq, that they wouldn't have been able to come to Bosnia this summer for our summer school. And so that way it also makes it a little bit easier to share this information.
That's great. So to follow up from that, is there something that we could bring back and learn in the US from your experiences there? I mean, these are conflict areas. They are trying to put nonviolence into practice very powerfully with the youth. The youth are trying to do that in a very powerful way. You're obviously helping them with advocacy and coaching. Is there something you're learning from there that you think we can put into practice here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that one of the things that I really take away from my time in the Balkans, there's many things, but one of them is that, resistance movements, there are so many different kinds of nonviolent movements and resistance movements that are happening all around us all the time. And understanding the breadth and the diversity of what that looks like, to me, has been a really powerful way to look at nonviolence in like a much broader sense. And so one of the campaign that I was probably the closest to when I was living in Sarajevo is called Slobodna Zona. And this was a local initiative by a couple of young people, like teenagers, who found an abandoned lot, and it was, full of trash and like bricks and plants and stuff. And they got all these like 14, 15-year-old kids together and worked for months to clear this lot so that they could have like a secret place to meet and to plan things together, and kind of this like subversive place where they could come and they would have like cookouts and do theater shows, and they got younger kids to come and they would teach them things. And it was for me, an example of like everyday resistance or constructive resistance, these different kinds of activism that look different than something that might make the headlines. That's why I like Waging Nonviolence, because they're digging for these stories underneath, the biggest resistance movements that we hear about. And the more that I dug into these examples and these, campaigns in Bosnia especially, but all around the Balkans, the more that I realized, that especially places where they're really characterized by a history of violence, like Bosnia, it's so powerful to really like shift the script and to look at the deep impact that nonviolent movements and nonviolent campaigns have had on that region, which is almost never the story that people know. And I think in this country too, just knowing that the history of nonviolent movements in the United States is much more than sort of the Greensboro counter sit-ins, or it's not to discount the power of that, but to say, I really appreciated as a high school student learning about the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama. And there's all of these other examples that people don't necessarily know as much about, that can help us see how this is all around us and how we're a big part of it, rather than seeing it as something that only happens a few times every century in these big, explosive historical examples.
So you talk about,
Sarah,
sorry, go ahead, Sandra.
Sorry, if I could jump back in here. It seems like a good time to kind of tie everything you're saying about movements, plural, and you're talking about many different movements across the globe that are essentially nonviolent movements, even if they don't identify as such. And so I'm also doing the same thing, talking about, let's look at movements like BDS or defund the police or counter recruitment in high schools, no ROTC in New York City high schools. These are all essentially nonviolent anti-war movements, even if they don't identify as nonviolent movements. So I just wanted to kind of connect with you about the fact that we renamed our conference Nonviolence Works because of the Erica Chenoweth book, Why Civil Resistance Works, which really talks about movements, plural, 300 case studies of analyzing when movements embrace nonviolence, how they have a higher statistical likelihood of winning, of accomplishing objectives, of overthrowing tyranny. And I wanted to see if you had a comment on that.
Yeah, that was one of the first books that I read as I got into this work. And it was actually a book that I referenced a lot when I was in the Balkans talking with high school students about the idea of nonviolence, because a lot of them would say, well, there's almost like a self-deprecating way that they talk about their own history or their own government, sort of similar, I think, to some things we see in the US, like nothing can ever change here. The only way that this can change is through, war or violent uprising. And a lot of times in the Balkans, I would hear kids say, well, we just are destined to have, another war every 50 years. That's the only way that things change here. And I would show them, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's research. I would show them Beautiful Trouble and Waging Nonviolence. And I would say, let's actually look at whether or not, is it true? Let's test this idea out. Like, is it actually true that the only thing that has shaped your society is war? Or is it actually, the student protests in the 1990s and factory worker uprisings in Yugoslavia and the overthrow of Milosevic, the baby revolution in 2013, or the public plenums in 2014? And is it possible that there's actually a lot more that's shifting the undercurrents in our society? And part of that being how effective nonviolent resistance is and nonviolent action is, if we just are kind of willing to acknowledge it and to look at it. I think that's something that now I talk with a lot of people in the United States about, who say, nothing's going to change. Congress is so broken, like everything is so, and it's not to say that we don't have to sugarcoat everything and say, this is all like to dismiss how serious those concerns are and how real that frustration is. But I think that understanding that the United States also is much more shaped and affected by the powerful impact of nonviolent resistance in nonviolent action in all the different shapes that takes, really gives credence to all of the movements that have come before us, all the movements that are happening around us today. And I think that it's a way of us also kind of taking back people power, instead of just saying that all the power is vested in corporations and elected official or politicians and dirty money in politics. That a lot of this power comes from us if we're willing to stay engaged. And even at the accusation that we sometimes are called naive, or that we're, like that's okay, because I think knowing that our sustained engagement, maintaining our sense of hope, that this quote by Mariam Kaba, that hope is a discipline and that it's something we have to continue to practice, this abolitionist writer, is something that I take when I think about Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth's research today, is that, if we know that this work is powerful and transformative and just statistically more effective, then by sharing that with other people, we can also kind of bring people in on this work with us, instead of, and kind of try to shift the way that people think about what actually makes change in our societies. It's not just dark money and politicians, and that's a piece of it, but it gives those sort of forces more power if we remove ourselves from the process and say, well, I'm never going to make a difference anyways. And I think that kind of research gives me a lot of hope in what we do. Great.
Excellent answer. I have one final question. I don't know if Priya has any of her. Do you have a final question, Priya? Do you want to go first?
I do, because I think I can. Yeah, I need to ask on a question. Yes, on the question before, and tying it into hope, actually, now that you've answered that question. You talked about shifting the script, and you talked about hope. And I wonder, did you have a personal shift of script in yourself that led you to a lot of this work? Because you're doing work that's so broad, yet so focused around nonviolence. And I'm wondering if it came from a personal space.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think growing up in a Quaker meeting, so I was raised a Quaker. One of the things that I saw all around me were people who were kind of the lonely voice for peace, especially during the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. I was like 9 years old when that happened, when we invaded Afghanistan. And I remember, and this is obviously especially relevant in the coming weeks as we kind of, as the country and the world is kind of commemorating the 20 years since September 11th and the beginnings of the so-called War on Terror, that one of the things I remember from that period is that my family was hosting an exchange student from Italy, and I was like 9, so I was really obsessed with her. I thought she was the best thing that, you know, she was like 16 and my idol. And I noticed that after 9/11, we, as you know, 4th graders, we had to spend like 30 minutes every day singing patriotic songs, standing in a room with like our hand over our heart. And I thought about the Quakers that I knew, and I was like, something about this has to be wrong, but I didn't really know, you know, I was little, so I didn't really know what it meant. But at some point I told my mom, you know, I don't want to do this. I think that I want to refuse. And this was like very, very shortly after 9/11. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but I told my mom I wanted to stop standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. And this was like a really intense thing to do, I think, especially right then. And so I like refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance in my class. And I went to public school in New Hampshire. No one was doing anything like that. And it like everyone freaked out. It was a really big deal. I went to the principal's. I was like a straight A. I was a very good student. Everyone kind of didn't know what to do about it. And one of the staff from the local ACLU office, the American Civil Liberties Union office, came into my classroom the next day to tell my teacher, like in front of everybody, that I didn't have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And I felt so powerful. Like it was the best. Wow. It was like the best thing because, you know, it felt really good to know that actually just because my teacher or my school was telling me something, my mom and the ACLU were behind me in something different. And that's like shifted for me the way that I think of power. Power is not just like coming from your teacher, your, you know, whoever it is that's supposed to be the authority, but there are other people that you can listen to and that you can think of. And so that's like one of the biggest things that happened to me when I was a kid that helped me to sort of feel how powerful this could be. Of course, then there's other ways that developed, but that was, you know, I was like really little when that happened, and it was a really amazing experience.
That's great. It's a lovely way of not just, empowering yourself, but also realizing power doesn't necessarily stem from authority or designation or role, but you can go beyond what society deems is right and actually go and find the truth and what's right. Thank you for sharing that.
That's a really powerful story, Sarah. Thank you so much. My final question for you, Sarah, is if you were running a nonviolence conference and somebody told you that you should make 1 minute long videos for Instagram, and you had this great guest on named Sarah, and you wanted to ask Sarah a question about how could you sum up in your own personal way, what's a 1 minute reason to come to a peace and nonviolence conference on October 2nd? Go.
Oh boy, no pressure.
Whatsoever.
We can do a couple of takes if you want.
I think that it's important to come to a conference like Nonviolence Works because this is going to showcase a lot of different perspectives of people who engage in work that relates to nonviolent action, nonviolent resistance. And I believe that for us as people who believe in the power of nonviolence, understanding all the many different ways that people come into this work is important for us to figure out our own place in this work. It doesn't just look like one thing. There are a lot of different ways that we can bring nonviolence into our work. I bring it into the policy space in one way as a writer, and another way people do, direct action in another way. And I think having all those perspectives together can help us see how we fit in and how this sort of can inform us at such a critical moment when nonviolence is so needed in our society. So that's my pitch.
Perfect.
All right.
Perfect timing, Sarah. This has been a great interview. I think actually we're going to put up the whole long version and not have to edit it because everything you said was of God. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel a lot of inner light in you. It's so great to meet you, and we'll see you on October 2nd. I'm also really glad to see that you and Bill Light and George Lakey are also going to do a little pre-conference networking. That's really great too. So
yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for making the time. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Peace.